I have this thing about helmets. I seem to do a lot of stuff that requires helmets, like bicycling, skydiving, motorcycles, that sort of thing. With that in mind, there's a curiosity involved in this photo of me on a Harley Heritage Softail. My pained facial expression tells you that, well, this is not my regular ride. I was on it because I was shooting a freelance video that required me to ride it. It's not my helmet either, because if it were, you wouldn't see my face. This is how I like to style when I'm riding seriously. Anyway, so helmets for all these risky things, but when I fly an airplane, no helmet. And not many people I know wear helmets when flying either, so what's up with that? It's not like you can't buy a helmet designed for flying, tons of them out there, and it's not like they don't provide protection in an accident, because they certainly do. Maybe a little, maybe a lot. For me personally, and to be honest, I just hadn't thought much about it until I saw this video posted by a pilot who crashed high in the Austrian Alps last year. I'll put a link down in the description. He was wearing a helmet and it may have figured in his survival, but he still suffered facial injuries. But the big reason for not wearing a helmet brings me back to this photo. In non-helmet states, cruiser riders often skip the helmet, and if you see one at all, it's usually an open face design. Why? Harley riders just don't look right with a full face helmet. It's tradition, and you may remember what famed baseball impresario Bill Veeck said about tradition. It's a dead stinking albatross hung around the neck of progress. But let's not get carried away. You wouldn't wear a helmet in a car, at least I wouldn't, so why in an airplane? Part of it has to do with the risk of a crash and part of it with the consequences of a crash. In other words, crash worthiness or lack thereof. Let's take a little tour of my Cub. When it was built in 1938, crashworthiness was a word yet to be invented, so safety features weren't even an afterthought. For example, the 12-gallon gas tank is right in the cabin between the front seat and the engine firewall. It's not quite in the passenger's lap, but it's close. The instrument panel is 18 inches away from the front passenger. If the original had seat belts, it surely did not have shoulder harnesses. Seat belts weren't required in aircraft until 1951. This truss work in the overhead of the Cub carries the fuselage and wing loads, and in many crashes it has a nasty tendency to fold down into the cabin, squashing the occupants. Aircraft built through the 1960s and 1970s were better, but not much. Single diagonal shoulder harnesses for the front seats appeared in the late 1970s. By the 1990s, 26G energy-absorbing seats became common. With more cabin flail space, 4-point harnesses, and later seatbelts with airbags improved crash survival. Still, to this day, the majority of general aviation is not impressively crashworthy, at least not like your car, which is likely to have multiple airbags, reinforced doors, and energy-absorbing crumple zones. Since I'm a numbers guy, let me glaze your eyes for a minute comparing car, motorcycle, and airplane safety. It's not so much apples and oranges as apples and 10mm wrenches, like the one that's always missing when you desperately need it. The rational way to do this is by a rate-based comparison on accidents per number of registered vehicles. So for cars, just in terms of raw bodies, it's 11.9 deaths per 100,000 registered vehicles. Motorcycles are about 58, and G airplanes 127 per 100,000 vehicles. Injury data is harder to compare, but we know that about 65% of GA accidents cause injury or death. So probably those numbers aren't large enough to make you wet your pants with fear, and anyway, if you're like me, you're pretty sure you're not going to get in an accident anyway, so why worry about it, right? Maybe. But if you were thinking flying a light airplane isn't as risky as driving your car, you're deluding yourself by a factor of 10. Are motorcycles too crazy for you? Your airplane is twice as bad. The general aviation industry hasn't spent the kind of money on designs to minimize injury that the automotive industry has, nor has it extensively cataloged the sorts of injuries that happen in survivable crashes. Still, that's not to say nothing has been done. There is some data out there describing GA crash injuries, and it helps paint a picture of how you're likely to get hurt in an accident and what's likely to kill you. This study, for example, revealed that fractured ribs are a common crash injury. Some of these are probably caused by single diagonal shoulder harnesses that provide minimal restraint, or by striking the control yoke on impact. Next up are skull and facial bone injuries. These aren't hard to figure out either. This study done way back in 1966 found that the instrument panel in the typical airplane of the day was a lethal obstacle in a crash. This was in those heady days of freedom and self-determination before shoulder harnesses were introduced. These injuries are often called flail injuries, meaning that when an airplane hits something unyielding, the pilot and occupants flailed around, striking the panel. The control yokes or sticks. These injuries still occur. In fact, they're quite common, and that was the case in this spectacular accident that happened in California earlier this year. It got a lot of notice because the aircraft, it's a Cessna 172, landed on a road outside the Whiteman Airport boundary after an engine failure. That road is adjacent to an active rail line, and during the landing, the airplane clipped a railroad crossarm that caused it to impact on the tracks. This wreck turned out to be the very definition of a bad day turned worse when a commuter train bore down on the wreckage with the pilot still trapped inside. But some fast-acting and gutsy LA cops pulled the pilot clear of the wreckage just seconds before it was obliterated by the train. In this jumbled video image, you can clearly see that the pilot sustained facial injuries that are typical of flail injuries from hitting the panel, an A-pillar, or controls. Facial injuries are often what are called orbital fractures. That's the bony socket around the eyeball. Obviously, you'd like to prevent such a painful thing, but can you, and would a helmet help? There's pretty good data to suggest it would, but it's hardly bulletproof. Think of it as more like an additional injury protection in the margin. It works the same way that basic safety equipment does, like goggles in the workshop or a respirator in a dusty environment. You just use it by habit and it confers some benefit. Here's how that logic works, and here's the data behind it. Alaska has a lot of aviation accidents, so in 2009, the FAA's Regional Flight Standards investigated 649 accidents with an emphasis on improving crash outcomes. You know, with the idea of having to pick up fewer bodies. With an eye toward survivability, surgeons looked at autopsy reports of the 113 people who died in those crashes. 97 survivors were seriously injured. Only 5% of the accidents were considered unsurvivable. The study reported that helmet use is required for state-operated aircraft in Alaska and probably were a factor in reducing deaths and injuries. Surgeons found 27 autopsy reports that involved serious head injuries and estimated that helmet use could have saved up to 33 lives during the period they studied. So why don't pilots wear helmets? Fair question. The reasons given in the report were lack of comfort, reduced visibility, and of course cost. Helmets aren't cheap, although they can cost less than a quality motorcycle helmet. But another reason was vanity. It's just not cool to wear a helmet, and to be honest, that would be the main reason I don't wear a helmet. I mean, it's way cooler to have a concussion and multiple scalp lacerations than to wear a helmet. Everybody knows this. So the Alaska study isn't necessarily in depth, but it's as good as we've got for proving that helmets do indeed have some safety merit. You can scrub backwards here and look again at the accident numbers to decide for yourself if the risk is great enough to justify the cost and whatever discomfort a helmet entails. The Alaska research, however, did reveal that government aircraft pilots who regularly wore helmets prefer them over wearing just headsets. So that encourages thinking about a helmet as more of an improved platform for a headset than a bulletproof protective device, which it is not. What the research did not reveal is what kind of helmet to pick. As you might suspect, there are standards for helmet design, including a mil-spec for military helmets plus 3 for motorcycles, DOT, ECE 2205, and Snell. There's no specific standard for light aircraft helmets, and the Alaska report wasn't granular enough to show that one specific helmet or type of helmet is more protective than another. There's too little data to even hazard a guess on this. But there are a lot of flight helmets out there across a range of designs. Some are full-up military-style helmets popular with civil helicopter pilots, and some are similar to open-face motorcycle helmets, but capable of accommodating a headset. These are popular among ultralight and powered parachute flyers who are essentially entirely exposed to the elements with no or minimal windshield. Given the high likelihood of facial injuries, it's logical that a full-face helmet would be the best choice. Then again, there's no accident data to tell us if one of those would have prevented these injuries or, in fact, made cervical injuries more likely. In any case, a full-face helmet is probably neither practical nor comfortable in the typical light aircraft cabin. Then there's the issue of fitting it with a headset and a mic. One company called QH Aviation Services can fix you up with a kit for a mic and headphones and a full-face helmet if that's your desire. Our sponsor, Aircraft Spruce, has a wide range of flight helmets across a spectrum of prices from $300 to $3,000. Comtronics dominates this market with about a half dozen models. The only thing is, because of pandemic supply chain issues, you can't get any of them. I couldn't even get samples. One of the more impressive helmets was this one, the Lift AV1. Nice looking helmet. The company didn't answer emails or phone calls. This is the beginning of March. Hopefully, as the supply chain issues sort out, they'll answer the phone. I didn't intend to make this a helmet comparison video, but I did fly with 3 helmets to get a feel for the possibilities. This one is an old standby. It's the David Clark K10. It's got an inner cloth liner that carries the headset and that snaps into a hard nylon shell. It will accept a snap-on visor, and the interior has styrene padding that's not quite as encompassing as a typical motorcycle helmet. Weighs about 1.5 pounds and retails for $400. Think of it as a basic helmet with impact protection, mainly for the top of the head. A step up is this one. It's made by the Cowboy Supply company and comes as either a kit that you can install your own headset in, that basic model costs $415, or a complete setup with a Bose A20 for $1,765. It's similar to the K10, but styled on a military tactical helmet with a hard shell and a polystyrene impact liner. It's one size fits all, and it's available in other colors. It also has a nice flip-down visor that's a good alternative or even a supplement for sunglasses on a bright day. One thing I noticed is how much quieter it is than the headset alone, although you have to get the ear cups positioned just right to make that work. Between the visor and the helmet, it really does tamp down the airflow noise. Yet another step up is this one from Bonehead Composites. They actually make skydiving helmets, one of which I happen to have. This is the Ares flight helmet with an integrated Lightspeed Zulu and a flip-down visor. At $3,033, it's expensive for sure, but it's a nicely made helmet with good internal padding and well-made hardware, like the thumb knob and friction adjustment for the visor. To protect the visor itself, it stows under this opaque plastic cover with a tasty skull motif. It's more of a motorcycle thing than an airplane thing, but I kind of like it. For as quiet as the Sky Cowboy helmet is, the Ares is even quieter because of its larger size and snug fit. I first thought it might be a bit much for the Cub, but on the other hand, why the hell do I care if someone else thinks I'm living out my Walter Mitty fighter pilot fantasies with a $3,000 helmet and a 75 horsepower engine? Get your own fantasy. But should it include a flight helmet? I think it depends on what kind of flying you do. If you do utility flying such as glider or banner towing, skydiving flights in a single-engine airplane, pipeline patrol, or any flying where you wear a parachute, a helmet makes sense. It also makes sense in a tandem aircraft where there's less flail space, and also if you're flying into unimproved outback airstrips, as many people do these days. Those are the kind of flights where a nose over is likely and having some head protection would be worth the trouble. STOL competitions are popular and a lot of pilots flying in them are wearing helmets, although they aren't required. Aerobatic pilots typically wear parachutes and many wear these fabric flight helmets. These secure a headset against high G maneuvering but provide no impact protection. But even in ordinary training flying, a helmet could pay off. In this accident, for instance, investigators found bits of human hair on the doorframe. Pilot wasn't seriously injured, but if he had had a helmet, it would have been a paint smear instead. Personally, I would not wear a helmet in something like a Cirrus or a Diamond. They have more flail space and usually better seat belts, some with airbags. Speaking of which, seat belts, especially 4-point versions like this, are likely to be a much better protective investment than a helmet. So I'd do that first. Also, seat belts with airbags are now retrofittable. I'll follow up with a video on seat belts later on. Meanwhile, I'm really thinking about rocking these skull icons. Maybe get a tattoo to match. Way less boring than a headset. For AVweb, I'm Bertorelli. Thanks for watching.